Jonathan, it's great to see you today.
Thank you for having me on.
So, Jonathan, you're in charge of a very popular YouTube channel where you analyze the war. ATP Geopolitics has been popular since the war's foundations, and you're following very carefully what's happening in eastern Ukraine with Russia's illegal invasion. So, currently, a lot of people are saying that despite the image that Russia tries to promote that it's winning, Russia's not doing so good. In fact, Russia might need the ceasefire more than Ukraine. What are you seeing?
I mean, this is a golden question. We're always trying to work out who has the upper hand in the war. And there's been swings and roundabouts. You think certain times, oh, Ukraine's done amazingly. Other times, Russia are on the ascendancy. And, we're 3 years into the war. And my position is that Russia are hurting. Ukraine, obviously hurting as well. The difference being that Ukraine have fewer people to draw from than Russia. But Russia are on, I think, an economic precipice at the moment. And also militarily, they are struggling for material. We are seeing motorbikes, golf buggies, quads being used in greater numbers on the front line. And that gives you an indication that they are struggling to maintain decent combat assets, all these pieces of equipment that we were seeing in columns of 30 to 60 earlier on in the war. Now we're not seeing that so much. So we have some good indication that Russia aren't in a great place. And I think it was a great shame that when Trump came in on the 20th of January, his inauguration, he had a choice. Could he support Ukraine to the hilt, or does he go the other way? And actually, if that foot was kept on Russia's neck with regard to sanctions and with regard to huge amounts of aid, I think we could be seeing a very different front line at the moment. So the question is, who will the ceasefire most benefit if the two nations were to enter into an agreed upon ceasefire? And there are some analysts who would say, actually, Ukraine could do with keeping this war going. I mean, it sounds horrible. It's a war. You don't want people to die. You want the war to stop as soon as possible, or do you? The American position is you want the war to stop as soon as possible, irrespective of who that benefits. Actually, my position is for a just and sustainable peace to come about, Ukraine need to enter the negotiations in the best possible position, and that the first element of the negotiations need to be done on the battlefield. And so, actually, they could do with the war going on until I think Russia really collapse economically, if that can happen, and with the help of Western allies, I think that can happen. And in order for their production of military hardware to be able to be ramped up, which it is at the moment, and to start seeing that come into effect on the front lines, we're seeing a drone asymmetry have a really great effect. Where the Ukrainians are using more drones than the Russians on the front line, it appears, according to a lot of evidence. And Petr Pavel, the Czech president, the other day said, actually, Ukraine have a ratio of shells fired of 1 to 2, and it used to be 1 to 10. And we're hearing that the Ukrainians are probably going to procure around 3 million shells this year, and the Russians are going to produce maybe around 2 million, but that includes mortar bombs. And so you're thinking, actually, if you extrapolate this going forward, then actually Ukraine could work themselves into some kind of advantage in some context on the front line. And so, yeah, it's a really difficult question. It's very difficult to know exactly where each side stand, and how their forces are looking. What are the reserves of the Ukrainians at the moment? How many troops they have, being trained and ready to go at some point? What are the Russians looking like in terms of their own troop recruitment and mobilization? But I don't know. I get a sense that perhaps the Ukrainians could do without a super quick ceasefire. But then you can also build the case on the other side too.
So I think there's a lot of evidence that things are not going nearly as well as Russia had hoped. Can you talk about what's happening in Pokrovsk, for instance?
So Pokrovsk, again, like I was saying, swings and roundabouts when you look, operationally, strategically, operationally, tactically. I mean, if you go right down into Pokrovsk, we had a situation where the Ukrainians, it looked like the Russians were culminating, which is a kind of technical term. They're running out of material, energy, resources, and they kind of stalled along many areas of the front line where they had been grinding on. The Ukrainians were starting to take some small areas back south of Pokrovsk. But then the Russians more recently have actually started pushing the Ukrainians back there again. But then just up the road in a place called Toretsk, you have the Russians pushing forward there, but then the Ukrainians doing a lightning sort of thunder road strike into the middle of Toretsk just in the last week, and looking like they could take some territory back. So it's very difficult to know exactly, who's in the ascendancy. But the calculation is always at what cost. So for the Russians, they are taking land, and they have been consistently taking land off the Ukrainians. So when we go back to wonder, well, actually, does the ceasefire benefit the Russians or Ukrainians? We need to be thinking in terms of, okay, if the Ukrainians cede territory to the Russians, can it lead to some kind of Pyrrhic victory for the Russians, whereby they take territory, but at such a fundamental cost that it ends up exhausting them? And then the Ukrainians can say, right, you've taken that territory. It's not too important, that area, when you look at the whole map of Ukraine. I mean, obviously, all areas are important. You have to take them back some way. But it could be that the cost incurred on the Russians is just too much, and the Ukrainians might be able to take advantage of that at some point, because it's not an endless resource that the Russians have, both economically, in material and personnel. But the same with the Ukrainians, right?
But what's the cause of Russia's current setbacks in eastern Ukraine, where it's moving in and out of Pokrovsk, it's not able to maintain the lines that it had? What's the details? A lack of arms, lack of supply, a lack of soldiers, or poorly trained soldiers? What's behind all of this?
There are areas where the Russians definitely are in the ascendancy. So south of Pokrovsk, near what was Karakovo, they've moved past there. What was Vuhledar, they're a long way from there now. There are areas where the Russians are advancing, but again, the question is at what cost? I think the Russians are struggling for all of the above reasons, right? They are unable to produce enough new material, so they're refurbishing a lot of material and sending that to the front, but they are exhausting their stockpiles that are decades in the making. They are starting to rely more heavily on North Korea for their ammunition and material, and that gives you an indication that they're unable to produce these things themselves. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are getting a lot of support from allies. Unfortunately, the US has stepped back there. If the US was fully engaged in supporting Ukraine, then goodness me, the Ukrainians would be able to have just a lot more equipment than the Russians. And I think, so you have the material issue. There are claims that they are recruiting the Russians 30 to 40,000 personnel a month, and that is problematic because the Ukrainians are unable to match that. But the Russians are losing more than the Ukrainians, one estimates, and that could end up being round about the replacement numbers for what they're losing on a monthly basis in terms of all-round casualties. So yeah, poorly trained soldiers, low morale, poor communication between units, but they do have good units still operating in certain places using good tactics. So it's very dangerous to tar the entire army with the same brush. And as I mentioned before, drones. There are areas where the Russians have had advantages previously in terms of reconnaissance drones earlier on in the war, and possibly still now. But the Ukrainians, I think, have really, really ramped up drone production in terms of first-person view drones, Mavic-style drones that drop IEDs on troops, one-way attack drones, kind of Shahed equivalents, and then these reconnaissance drones. So, the Ukrainians have recognized where they've had weaknesses and have tried to do something about it. They've recognized that they've had weaknesses in the structure and organization of their own armed forces. So they're moving to a core style organization. They're trying to improve all areas they can, but it's very difficult when you're at war, right? Trying to do these things. But the Russians, I think, are struggling for all the reasons that we know, and some of which we've mentioned, but their whole way of doing their modus operandi is to just throw troops into a problem. And as long as they have that supply of troops and they've got enough armaments, whether those armaments are quads and motorbikes and golf buggies, then that still enables them to take territory.
That's really interesting. So, where have we seen Ukraine's production shift over the past few months? What's changed?
Well, they're trying to produce obviously everything they can. And what the significant change that we've seen, and it started with Denmark, is so when you're a country, right? So let's rewind a little bit. If you're a country and you want to help Ukraine, ideally, from your own country's point of view, you want to give Ukraine your own weaponry that you produce yourself, because that gives your own country an economic stimulus, and it gives, your tax money is being spent inside your own country, and you're giving the stuff you provide to Ukraine. But for countries like Denmark, and they were the first to really start doing this, there's only so many defense products that you make, right? And so eventually you end up saying, well, actually, we haven't got anything else we can give you. So the second best thing is to give that money to Ukraine and invest in Ukraine. And then Ukraine gets to produce that stuff. And it's also an economic stimulus for Ukraine, and they get tax revenue and so on and so forth. And then you get this added benefit that Ukraine is able to make some of these things, or most of these things, much cheaper than the countries that are helping them. And so therefore, take the 2S22, the Bogdana 2S22, which is a self-propelled gun, so a howitzer on wheels, and they can make basically two of them for every one Caesar they get from France, as in if you're comparing the costs. So although the Caesar might be a better self-propelled gun, the Ukrainians are asking, well, do we have one slightly better gun or two guns? And they're probably going to go for two guns, especially when making them in Ukraine stimulates our own economy and gets tax revenue. And then the third thing that a country can do is then go to a completely different country. So Denmark goes, right, we make our stuff ourselves, or we invest in Ukraine, or we go and buy something that they need that neither we make nor Ukraine can make. So Patriot missiles in the US, right? And we can invest in the US and get that to Ukraine. So now we're starting to see particularly European nations and the EU realize that investing in Ukraine is a good way to help Ukraine. And in fact, it's arguably the best way to help Ukraine in terms of if your objective is that Ukraine wins a war, because they make stuff themselves, they give jobs to their own population, they get that tax revenue, they make things more cheaply, and then you get the further added benefit that the supply lines, the maintenance for the equipment they make is easier to do. The supply lines are shorter. The logistics footprint is within Ukraine generally. So they're starting to make. They're now up to around 40 Bogdana to S22 a month, which is fantastic. I mean, that's probably above replacement value for replacement numbers for them. They're also making the towed version of them. They are making APCs themselves, armored personnel carriers, and sort of MRAPs, which are mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, slightly more armored APCs, if you like. They're not quite making infantry fighting vehicles, which are have more, bigger guns on them, if you like, than say an MRAP or something like that. And they're not making tanks really. So there are certain areas where it would be great if they could manufacture these things. But then you've got to think, okay, the Russians are going to be trying to hit these factories every single night, every single day. And so, it's quite challenging to scale up production of anything in Ukraine. So there are certain things that still need to be built outside of Ukraine, but they're each successive month, they seem to be adding to what they're building. And that gives them much better chance of prevailing in this war, where Russia's industrial base is suffering from sanctions and suffering from labor shortages and so on and so forth. And Ukraine are pretty good at striking actual military targets rather than apartment buildings. So I think, again, it goes back to there are certain elements of this war where you look at Ukraine, you think, yeah, I'd rather be Ukraine than Russia in this kind of context. And 3 years into war, fighting against what was supposed to be the second greatest army in the world, I think that Ukrainians have a lot to be proud of.
Absolutely. So looking ahead, though, do you think there's going to be continued European support? You've seen recently that the Europeans made a trip to Kiev to discuss what was going to happen next. And there was a ceasefire that Putin was supposed to abide by, which he did not. So what are the consequences going to be? What do you think will come next from Europe?
I think both Putin and actually Trump, I think they're quite similar in many ways, in terms of you need to stand up to them. You need to show strength. And I think Zelensky has, with the cards he's had, and he has had cards, despite what some people have said, he's actually played some pretty good hands. In fact, arguably the best hands he possibly could have done. So, the Europeans came together. So you know, you had Merz from Germany, Macron from France, Starmer from the UK, and Tusk from Poland came to Kiev, as you said, got together with Zelensky, came up with this great plan that was backed with Trump. They were on the phone to Trump and they said, right, we're going to have a ceasefire starting Monday, right, midnight Monday. And if you don't adhere to the ceasefire, Russia, then we are going to hit you with sanctions and military aid. And that was backed up by the US. Unfortunately, Trump then kind of went back on that and then said, well, how about meeting in person? Well, actually, Putin replied with, no, we're not going to do ceasefire, but we'll meet in person on the 15th. And so Zelensky is then met with, okay, the US seems to want to now not follow through on the ceasefire and get us to meet in person. Well, how about I call Putin's bluff and says, okay, we'll meet on Thursday, but you are going to meet in person with me. And that's kind of all Zelensky could do, which is try and force Putin to do something he really doesn't want to do. And if he doesn't do it, then he gets the consequences. The problem is Europe said, you came together with hopefully the backing of the US and said, we're going to be really strong on Russia if you don't adhere to a ceasefire. And then they had to go back on their word because Trump's America didn't seem to support them in the consequences if the ceasefire was not adhered to. And like we know as parents or as teachers, if you ever issue a threat with a consequence, you need to follow through on that. Because if you say, right, if you don't do this, I'm going to do that, and then the child says, okay, oh, I'm quite scared of that, and then they kind of push the boundaries, and then they end up doing that, and you don't give them the consequences that you promised, you are just seen as a weak authority figure. And that's what has happened with, unfortunately, Europe and the United States, which is Russia. If you do this, then we're going to do that. Russia did that thing that you threatened consequences with, and the consequences didn't come. That is dangerous. And it sends a message to Putin and the Kremlin that they can get away with pushing those boundaries. So it's really important that if Putin doesn't go to meet with Zelensky in Turkey on Thursday, that the US and Europe and Ukraine, the US and Europe absolutely hit Russia as harshly as possible with particularly economic sanctions, but also military aid if at all possible. But will they do that? Yeah, they have to. They have to. Like they haven't done it with the Monday ceasefire. They have to do it with that. With if Putin doesn't go to Ankara, the problem is I think Trump is trying to get out of coming down hard on Putin. Every conceivable opportunity where he's had to be hard on Putin, he has shied away from doing that, and that is deeply, deeply frustrating.
So, in the course of this war, over the past 3.5 years, there's been another side of this outside of Ukraine, and it's those who are using social medias, for instance, for a lot of different things, to promote support for Ukraine, but also to fight Russian disinformation, amongst many, many, many other works. What have you noticed in the past few years?
Well, this is a fascinating topic for me. I'll just give you briefly, if I can, my journey into what I'm doing now. I am a full-time YouTuber now, which I never thought 5 years ago that would be a thing, right? So I had a job, I had a regular job, and I was teaching, and I got primary progressive multiple sclerosis. And that meant that I was just unable to keep doing that job. So I started working from home. I was doing reporting, I was writing books, I was reporting, doing some sort of journalism from home, sort of part-time, and another job. And then eventually I had a philosophy YouTube channel, which it was kind of like just a hobby type thing. And then I started both writing articles and doing the odd video on the Ukraine war because I became obsessed with it as soon as it started in February 2022. My articles got quite a bit of traction, and my YouTube videos started, there was a real appetite for this. And I was like, this is great. And I wasn't being sort of mercenary or grifting about this. I was like, I am totally obsessed with Ukraine, and I still am. 3 years later, I am obsessed with the war in Ukraine. And this was it enabled me, these YouTube videos, to feed my obsession. And then I just got more and more into learning about everything to do with the war in Ukraine and Ukraine's history and culture and so on and so forth, to the point where I was like, I now need to stop the job I was doing from home and actually just adopt being a YouTuber full time. And what I've noticed is there's a whole ecosystem of people doing this. And in fact, this is a war that has fully embraced social media. And in fact, Ukraine particularly, I think, have benefited from this. So, from my point of view, I'm a news aggregator and an analyst, an autodidact. I've taught myself all this stuff, right? But I have people that come to me as their main source of news for Ukraine. And of course, I rely on people like your good self and the mainstream media outlets doing the wonderful work that they do. They often get, trashed mainstream media because MSM, blah, blah, blah. But actually, without them, we'd have nobody on the ground doing the important work of reporting on things like the Ukraine war. So Kiev Post and all of the other entities inside Ukraine are super important, as are international media outlets, for helping to digest what's going on, report on and digest what's going on. But then someone like myself comes along and then aggregates all of that. But I spend literally every waking hour on concern with Ukraine, right? And it is my obsession that allows me to then become someone that kind of knows what they're talking about to some degree, and people appreciate that. So I am a reporter on Ukraine and a news aggregator, but also an influencer in a really positive way, not a propagandist. I will present a positive narrative of Ukraine where authenticity, integrity, truth, and accuracy are at the heart of what I do, right? And that's my philosophical background. I like will not lie to my audience. I will call a spade, and if things are going badly for the Ukrainians, I will say that. I'm absolutely 100% behind truth and integrity and accuracy. So you have this whole ecosystem of all these people reporting and discussing the war in Ukraine and mapping, and I do some mapping as well. And then you have like the open source intelligence community online, on whether it be Twitter or Telegram, all these different places, or X, sorry, and Blue Sky, and they're all operating to do geolocation and material identification and so on and so forth. And then that's another element. And then you've got like crowdsource and crowdfunding for the war. I mean, this is the first war in history where, I mean, there's always been crowdfunding to a degree, and you can go back to the Second World War and see elements of communities getting together and making things for the soldiers and whatever. But my channel has been involved in generating about £250,000 of, and I'm not a big channel, right? So I'm super proud of the people that watch my stuff for coming together and supporting and generating income to buy trucks and to buy this and to buy that for the Ukrainian armed forces. And so the world of social media is very important for helping Ukraine, for influencing people, hopefully in the right direction, and countering disinformation, for reporting on the war. And the Ukrainians know this. So the Ukrainian units have their own press teams. Like each unit generally has their own press teams. And the better units really know how to manipulate social media very well. Whether it be, Third Assault Brigade, you've got all sorts of different, all the main units that do a really good job of A, fighting, and B, selling what they're doing. Not selling in that they are presenting what they're doing in a way that people really appreciate. And then it's a virtuous cycle. Then they're like, right, they want drones. I'll be happy to contribute to their drones, that drone fundraiser they're doing, and they then end up doing better on the front lines because they've got better kit, and it's this virtuous cycle. And it's just absolutely fascinating how social media and the online world is playing such an important role in how Ukraine are able to fight literally with equipment that's crowdfunded, but also how we are understanding the war in Ukraine from people like myself who are absolutely obsessed with the war and are ensconced in this ecosystem 24/7. And it's you are seeing virtually every engagement being recorded from drones, of course, and put on social media. I mean, we'll like historians will look back on this war as being groundbreaking for so many different reasons.
Absolutely the case. Jonathan, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.